welcome to FOI Fest 2026.
Hi everybody, my name is Ben Whitty. I'm an academic here at Birkbeck College, and I'm very aware that only I stand between you and lunch. So I will be as quick as I can. Just to remind you, when you do leave for lunch, everybody who's here in person, do look over at Senate House, because Senate House was the inspiration for the Ministry of Truth in George Orwell's 1984, where his wife worked. Okay, so I'm going to talk very briefly about my experience as an academic, which I think is going to be quite distinct from the experience of journalists and campaigners. So I want to talk to you a little bit about why I use FOI, how I've used it, and then end with a few kind of tips for the future. The first really important thing to say, and this is something that both George and Lucas talked about, is that you should only use freedom of information if you need to. I only use it if I can't find the information or data any other way. I'm very conscious of the burden that I could create. So how have I used it? The main way in which I've used it is to try and look across a kind of big picture of how a policy or issue is unfolding across the country. So what that normally means is local government and making so-called round robins to those bodies. I've also made freedom of information requests to central government and recently to some of the newly publicly owned train bodies as well. In terms of what kind of issues I've used it for, I was very interested a few years ago, as they abolished lots of the audit mechanisms across local government, the extent to which people are using their own audit rights. You probably all know better than me that for a few tantalising days each year, you can go to your local council and look through the budgets, either physically or online. So I made a series of FOI requests to see how many people have been availing themselves of that right over the past 5 years. More recently, there's a lot of talk in the United States about different government departments and bodies using AI as a means to process freedom of information requests. So I made a series of FOI requests to central government departments to see if they were doing so. Broadly, the answer is they are not. The one that I'm actually most pleased with is one of the most recent ones. I got this from a kind of hint from a Guardian piece of investigation about in the aftermath of the dumping of the statue of slave owner Edward Colston in Bristol. I was intrigued as to what extent councils had been quietly doing different things with their public spaces. Because, as you know, councils still retain the power to change street names without public consultation. And I actually discovered through a series of experimental FOI requests just to a few councils that actually there has been a lot of quite positive renaming, democratic discussion, QR codes going on up and down the country in some places that you wouldn't actually expect. What's probably of most interest to you, though, is I've not just used freedom of information to find out about things. I've used freedom of information to find out if freedom of information works. So I designed this experiment with a group of academics from King's. And what we did is we used parish councils and we asked a series of them an FOI request and a series of them something that was very obviously not an FOI request. We wrote in big letters at the beginning, this is not an FOI request. And we wanted to measure which got the best response. We then took it a step further and we also asked them to do something outside the boundaries of the Act, which is to publish that piece of information on their website, which they absolutely do not have to do. Ta-da! Freedom of information works. A freedom of information request was twice as likely to get a response than you just asking. Got even more interesting, though, that when we looked at the thing outside the boundary of the ask, will you publish this? A freedom of information request was 3 times more likely to get a public body to respond. So just as a few final thoughts, there are problems with using freedom of information. The real bottleneck is actually the basics, finding where to send the freedom of information request, getting the right address, especially at local government when things are in constant change, and also getting a response. That can be really difficult, especially for much smaller bodies who kind of have my sympathies. Sometimes the information doesn't exist. A lot of councils, for example, didn't hold any data about who'd looked over their accounts. That's often because nobody had, but some of them just didn't hold that information. And this is where my life is a bit easier than campaigners or journalists, it does take time. But luckily, academia moves much more slowly than campaigning. Yeah. So finally, my top tips, which are actually rather similar to what I've gone before as well. Ask yourself why you need it before you do. Before you make a request, check their disclosure logs, if they have one. Check what do they know. If you think you've had a bright idea for an FOI request, there's a very good chance someone else has had it at some point before. I always use my academic privilege. I scatter the word academic all over the email. I tell them about what it is I'm researching. I give them access. I make sure they can see my publications page and things like that and say why I want the information. I also ask nicely, and I try and be very patient and realize that sometimes this can take kind of 5 or 6 emails to really clarify what you want. But going back to what George has said and what Martin always says in his very helpful advice on this, keep a good spreadsheet. That is absolutely the key to making successful FOI requests. And just final thoughts for the future, and actually both Lucas and George mentioned this, I'm really interested in these new bodies that are covered or partly covered by Freedom of Information or EIRs, particularly water companies, and also as of next year, 8 out of 10 train journeys are going to be in a publicly owned train that's subject to the Freedom of Information. So I'm very interested in how we can actually use those to measure freedom of information in the future. Thanks, everybody.
Hello to our most completist listeners. If you're still listening, thank you so much for sticking with this right to the end. I'm Miff from My Society, and it's my job to put these podcasts together. And you know what? It would be really helpful for us to know a bit more about how and why you are listening to them. So if you have a moment, please do take a look at the show notes, where you'll find a link to a very short survey. It'd help us so much if you could fill that in. Thank you.